Hello and welcome to today's webinar all about the Day of Remembrance on Day of Remembrance. My name is Lauren Cornegay-Dollar and I'm the Adult Programs Coordinator here at the National Museum of the Pacific War. Before we get started, I'd like to see where everybody is streaming in from, and also hopefully everybody is staying warm. It's a little chilly out there today. All right, so you guys already know the drill, so you're already sounding off of where you're coming in from. I see Texas, Arizona, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Nebraska. But I'm really excited about our guest speaker today. And as you guys know, I like to hand the reins over as quickly as possible to them so they can spend as much time on their topic. So I'd like to go ahead and introduce our guest speaker for today, Executive Director of the Japanese American Museum in Oregon, Hanako.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Lauren. I'm so excited to be here with you all today to kind of talk about the Japanese American experience during World War II. So this is kind of the overview for today. I'm going to kind of start off with a little introduction, and then we're going to do a short film. Then we'll talk about the Executive Order 9066 and the Japanese American incarceration experience. So like Lauren said, I'm the executive director of the Japanese American Museum of Oregon. So our mission is to preserve and honor the history and culture of Japanese Americans in the Pacific Northwest, to educate the public about the Japanese American experience during World War II, and also to advocate for protection of civil rights for all Americans. So the work that we do at the Japanese American Museum of Oregon is not only having an exhibit, as you can see, like we have an image of our exhibit down here at the bottom, but we also manage a site where we have the Japanese American Historical Plaza, which is on the waterfront, and we also do other programming, whether it's film screening or some other panel discussions as well. So we have a lot of information. You can visit us at jamo.org because some of it is available online as well. But let's kind of get back to why we're here. So a little bit more about myself is that I am a fourth generation, fifth generation Japanese American. So my great grandmother was born in Hawaii, and my grandparents were also born in the States as well. So I have a few pictures that I'd love to share with you, where right here we have my grandfather. So this is my grandfather. He was actually drafted out of the camps into the military intelligence service, while my grandmother here had to essentially raise 3 children on her own while she was incarcerated at Manzanar. And you can see that this is the barrack at Manzanar where my family was living at the time. And here's a nice family photo that I have. So my great aunt, who just recently passed, she was actually the author of Farewell to Manzanar. But you can see my grandmother's here, my grandfather's here. I have my great grandmother here, my great great grandmother, and my great grandfather with my Aunt Patty and Uncle George here. So I have a deep connection to this history, and this is why I do the work that I do. So I just wanted to let you know at least my background, and you could, we'll talk a little bit more about my family later on as well, but you kind of now have like a personal connection through me to learn about this story. So one of the first things I'm going to start off with is kind of this, for lack of a better term, it's like a music video about the Japanese American immigration to incarceration. We're using the music of Kishibashi, and it's this music video is using a lot of historical images to kind of take you on this visual journey, learning about the incarceration history and the immigration history of Japanese Americans here in the US. And so you'll see some images in there, and we'll kind of talk about it afterwards. So we'll start off with this overview video, and then we'll kind of deconstruct it afterwards. So we'll get this started.
when in song we are blessed to be, mending the rift of our apathy. I answer, you remain. Days on end after the end of the cancer. One day you will follow at the sound of laughter. One day we'll fall in love.
I hope that you guys enjoyed watching that. It's kind of just more of a visual journey of the history, and we're going to kind of talk a little bit more about that as we go. But one of the first things I kind of want to talk to you is that you're going to hear me use probably a little bit different terminology than you're used to hearing about talking about the incarceration. So one of the things is like, we all know that there is power to words, and the Japanese American community got together to discuss the importance of how do we want to talk about this history? Because historically, a lot of people know this as the Japanese internment. And what we try to do is that, we want to clarify the language so it makes more sense, because a lot of the people who were actually incarcerated during World War II were actually US citizens. So a lot of them were children, about a third of them were children under the age of 18 or so. And so internment in the legal sense is that if you're taking people who are of the nationality of the folks that you're at war with, you could remove them from the population in an internment. But since 2/3 of them were US citizens, it didn't quite fit internment. And then plus a lot of them were Americans. So that's why we use Japanese American incarceration. But for the first generation immigrants, internment is actually appropriate for them because they were not US citizens, as they were barred by law from becoming naturalized until the 1950s. So you'll hear me use incarceration throughout this presentation when I talk about it. So one of the first things that you were able to see was about like the immigration. Folks were coming in over from Japan because, there was an economic crisis over there with the development of, or the US forcing open Japan, and you have the industrialization, which took out a lot of the samurai class, and then people needing more area and more land to kind of work off to kind of sustain their families. So there was an opportunity to move into the United States to work in a lot of the manual labor jobs, since there was a lot of issues during that time, especially with the Chinese Exclusion Act. It kind of paved the way for Japanese immigration to the United States. And as people were starting to immigrate, they're starting to settle down. They're creating families, homes, communities. And so this is actually images on the left is actually from Seattle. And then we have this image on the right where you see a family, they have a house and, raising their families within this home. But then people are also starting to, create communities as they're settling down. And this is actually a really cool image on the left, which is, you could tell that is from the 20s, because a lot of people are in flapper kind of dress. And this was actually a Valentine's Day dance. And so it's pretty cool to look at these historic images and see how the Japanese American community is starting to develop. And a lot of it's because that there was a lot of racism that existed, where because of housing issues, like specifically here in Oregon, where Japanese Americans weren't able to live in certain areas, so they had to kind of congregate in areas where they're allowed to live. And then it kind of created these smaller communities of like these Japan towns, also known as Nihonmachi. But sometimes you get folks who were like, well, why aren't you integrating with the community? Why aren't you doing this? Where it was kind of a struggle where, because of the racism, it forced them to kind of congregate within familiar groups. But then yet, because of that safety net that they're trying to create, the people who are excluding them from community is now questioning, why aren't you, integrating better? So, those are similar things that exist today. So I just want to touch on that. But, Japanese Americans start to, establish themselves and they start to thrive. Like, this is a really interesting image here of Cascade Soda, a water company, which this is was Beacon Hill, Seattle. And this gentleman here is Japanese American business owner, and he ended up selling the company a little bit before the war began. But again, you see people are starting to own homes. They're, thriving in their community that they've created. But there was a lot of racial prejudice that existed during this time. So you could see some of the derogatory language that they were using. And this image right here in the bottom right is quite interesting, because this is actually, I believe, in the 1930s in San Francisco at a 4th of July parade, where, you could kind of see that they were anti-Japanese in sentiment. But then all of that racial tension that was, building up over the years, kind of culminated with the attack on Pearl Harbor. So then you start seeing folks are being, talked about being forcibly removed from their homes. So let's kind of talk a little bit about that aspect. So what is Executive Order 9066? So Executive Order 9066 was the order that allowed for the mass incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. Although it didn't specifically target Japanese Americans, it was giving authority to defense folks, for national defense purposes, that they could create military zones to exclude people. But using this executive order, the government was able to then create these military zones and then say they want to exclude Japanese Americans from it. So you have the Western Defense Command, which was based out of the Presidio in San Francisco. They were like, okay, we want to get rid of all people of Japanese ancestry from the West Coast. And so they utilized that executive order to then create these policies. And I want to point out that right here at the bottom, you can barely see it, but it says all Japanese persons, both alien and non-alien, will be evacuated. So that's language that was used by the government back then. So what is a non-alien? A non-alien is a US citizen, but they didn't want to say both aliens and citizens. So they said both aliens and non-aliens. So you could kind of see how language even back then was kind of being used to try to, alleviate some of the potential tensions of the larger public, seeing, what's going on. But it was also kind of frustrating because, one of my mentors, Norm Mineta, he would always say, like, I would never go and say I'm a proud non-alien, So it's one of those things to think about, like how language was used to target different people. So with these exclusion orders, these are images that you may have seen in the area of like military personnel putting these up on walls to instruct when people had to leave their area. So, some folks got about a week. Some folks sometimes got a couple weeks to kind of figure out what they're going to do with their lives. But the one issue is that the government wasn't quite being clear and direct of what's happening. They're just like, on this day, you need to report to this station and you're going to be taken away. For how long? People did not know. So some people were thinking, okay, well, is this going to be permanent? Is it not going to be permanent? So some folks are trying to liquidate all assets, thinking, you know what, we have no clue what's going to happen. So let's just try to get as much cash on hand. And then we'll see where it goes. Some people who had businesses and properties, they're working with their neighbors to be like, hey, could you watch my property or not? So it kind of led to a lot of confusions and also a lot of fire sales of people just trying to liquidate all assets. And people were literally selling property pennies to the dollar. And so there was a lot of economic loss during this time because of the lack of communication with the government to the people. So I want to show you this map where when I was talking about the exclusion zone is this red line right here. And I don't know if you can see it with my cursor, which was determined by the Western Defense Command that this is where they wanted to exclude people of Japanese ancestry. And originally there was 2 military zones. The first one actually went down through half of California. And so some folks, there was like a small window of time, then moved, like let's say they were in San Francisco and then moved to Fresno because Fresno was on the other side of that line. But then eventually military zone 2 was enacted, which moved that line all the way to encompass the whole footprint of California. So there were some folks who were trying to move inland to kind of avoid incarceration if they were able to, but there was a lot of challenges with that. You know, most of the time, the folks who were able to do so had family in other states that were beyond the exclusion zone. But then there was a story of a family in Northern California that were trying to make their way to Colorado because the governor of Colorado was trying to welcome as many people as possible, and kind of actually ruined his political career because he actually lost re-election. But what he was trying to do was just trying to help folks kind of reestablish their lives. But this family, they said that they were kind of going through Tahoe, but then they weren't able to get people to sell them like gas or anything like that. But the family had a discussion where they're like, we could continue to try to get our way into Nevada and eventually to Colorado, but we don't know how people are going to respond to us. So they ended up choosing to go back and be removed because, you know, they thought that that was potentially a safer bet. But some people were successful moving, some people weren't during that small window of time. But yeah, so when people were being forcibly removed, they were given these tags that they had to wear. So it became very like impersonable, and you know, you're no longer referred to by your family name. You now have a family number. And this image on the right is actually, I find, a very powerful image of a young woman who's like mourning the loss of her life as she's being moved from Bainbridge Island out. So we have additional images of forced removals and stuff here, but I know I'm starting to run out of time. But when people were being forcibly removed, first people were sent to these so-called assembly centers, and they're basically temporary detention facilities, and they're indicated by these circles here on the screen. And then that was because originally the government, when they were thinking about if the United States was going to enter into World War II or into war with Japan, that they actually identified Manzanar and Poston as sites. But that was only for the first generation Japanese immigrants, not their children. So when the Western Defense Command said, hey, we're going to take everyone and anyone of Japanese ancestry, even children, you know, and they took children out of orphanages and adopted homes and placed them at Manzanar, which Manzanar was the only camp that had an orphanage. But when the government was like, hey, we're going to take everyone and anyone of Japanese ancestry who's in this exclusion zone, it actually kind of caused an issue where they're like, oh my gosh, the government wasn't prepared to actually incarcerate all these people. So that's why they needed these temporary assembly centers to have people there as a temporary station until these triangles, which is the 10 main camps that people think about when they hear about the Japanese American incarceration, was actually developed. So, but this in of itself is quite large. Like we could go into like a lot of different conversations, but for the sake of this overview, we're going to continue on. But when people were then sent to these more permanent facilities, this is what they're looking at, barbed wire fences, guard towers. And again, they were only able to take what they can carry. So they didn't have all of the things that, you and I would feel comfortable with, within our homes. It was just only the things that they could take with them. So a lot of families lost most of their family history during that time. Like my family, we don't have any photos pre-World War II because that was all lost. So all the stuff that we have is actually more from the 50s because it took several years for our family to make enough money to start, being able to go take photos and or own a camera. So we don't have anything from the 40s and before. So, but these camps that were developed, they were like hastily built. There was documentation that said that these units were built within an hour, and each one of these barracks would house the occupants would be like 5 or 6 units. So 5 or 6 families could be in one of these buildings. So quality was not great. But then the conditions in camp was quite, different from people in their previous lives. People had single family homes, they had their own space, their own rooms, and now they're living in this communal environment where there was a breakdown of the family structure during this time. You could see down here in the bottom left, the showers, there were no partitions. That was also the same with the bathrooms, but in some of the camps, the Japanese American communities were able to effectively advocate to actually get partitions. But you can see like this is now a more communal lifestyle. This is one layout of a camp over at Minidoka where you could see how large it is. It was 33,000 acres. The residential area is made up about 900 acres here in these numbered blocks. But you had about 13,000 people living in this facility at the time. But then you also have, people trying to live out their lives in this new reality. And boredom was a big thing for some of the older folks. But I really love this picture on the right because it says U.S. property, theft or damage punishable under federal law. And these two folks are stealing wood to try to make furniture. So I always found that as an act of resistance that I always like to show. But it was also harder on the older folks because the government kind of broke down the power dynamics of everything where the older generation weren't able to hold like prominent roles in the community, that it was only their American born children were able to do so. So it led to a lot of depression and a lot of conflict within families as well. But then life continued on, you got people getting married, having children, but you also had people, passing away during this time as well. So yeah, but then as part of the war effort, a lot of folks ended up joining into the military. You had women going into the WACs, you had young men going to the 442nd Regimental Combat Team or the Military Intelligence Service. But then you also had families who were incarcerated, but also had to bury their loved ones who were fighting for this notion of freedom, yet they didn't necessarily had it at home. But then you also had those who were protesting. We have these draft resistors on the left-hand side. This was part of a large mass trial over at Heart Mountain, where a lot of the young men were like, give us back our freedoms and we will go fight in this war. But you cannot treat us like American citizens, but expect us to behave like American citizens and go fight for the United States when our family is being treated like this. So there was a lot of people who did it based off of principle. And actually, this is one of my friends, Takashi Hoshizaki. He was one of the youngest draft resistors. And he ended up serving, I think it was like 18 months or so in a federal penitentiary. And he told me one time that he said, he felt bad about his parents being in camp because he was more comfortable in a federal prison. than he was when he was at Heart Mountain. So you could kind of see some of those aspects there. And then there are some people who are like, they decided to renounce their citizenship because they're like, we need to if the US doesn't want us, let's see what else is out there as well. So there's lots of sub stories to this larger incarceration history that if you do have time, it's worthwhile to kind of dive in a little bit more to learn about it. But with the closure of the camps, people were essentially given $25 and a one-way ticket to go and rebuild their lives. So here is actually administrator at Minidoka, shaking the hand of an incarceree, and it's like, good luck. But we also have stuff in some of our collections. This is actually part of the Minidoka National Historic Site collections where, they actually had the ticket and they saved it and then gave it back to the museum so that they could tell this story of resettlement. But after the war, it wasn't great going back where it's like, oh, the war ended. People came back to stuff like this. There was still a lot of anti-Japanese sentiment that existed. This is actually of, they're related to me. We're like, I think second or third cousins, but of them going back home to Beacon Hill, Seattle, and this is what they saw. So it was still a hardship to recover after the war. But, the real realities of starting over was harsh because, again, this is my grandfather, right? He was in the military intelligence service. He served the country while his wife and children were left in a camp. And when he came back from war, he was not able to find a job because of the anti-Japanese sentiment that still existed, even though he was a veteran. So he thought, you know what? Maybe I'll just be a door-to-door salesman, and make some money that way. So he tried to do that. But unfortunately, no one wanted to buy from a Japanese American salesman. So he ended up becoming a professional wrestler. So this is the image on the right where he went by the name of Professor Sugi, and then he did a tag team with Kato over here on the right. So this is my grandfather. And so he ended up doing the wrestling circuit for, I think it was like 15 years or so. But it's because at the time with the people of the US, especially with the wrestling circuit, we need enemies for our white wrestlers to fight. So he had to put his pride aside to be, do stereotypical Japanese things to encourage, more viewers to watch and stuff. So I always often wonder, because I never got to meet him. He passed away before I was born. It's like, if he had conflicts there. But, it was hard for people as they're trying to start their lives over again. But we need to, I'm fasting forward a little bit, maybe quickly, but starting in the 70s, leading up into the 80s, there was this whole movement for redress where a lot of the children who were born in camp or were young in camp, they're coming of age and they're like, hey, we need to talk about this, or we want to talk to our parents about this who were, young adults, and they didn't want during camp, but they didn't want to talk about it. So a lot of the youth, what we call the Yonsei, third generation, so that would be my father's age folks, they started to, try to get money to do investigations, and eventually they were able to convince President Carter to do a congressional study, which led to these large community discussions. And then eventually it led to the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, which you see here with Reagan signing it. But that's what allowed the US government to actually provide an official government apology. And it's really interesting because my grandmother, as a child growing up, and not understanding this history, because my family rarely talked about it. Even though, we all knew my Auntie Jeannie wrote her Will to Manzanar, out of context, it seems like, oh, this is just our family history. It must have been really obscure that didn't impact anyone. But, as I started to come of age and do more research, I'm like, oh my gosh, this affected a lot of people. But my grandmother had this letter and also a letter from President Clinton on the wall going upstairs to her room. And as a child, I was like, why does she have these letters from the presidents, right? And it wasn't until I got to college where I realized, I think it was really important for her because she would always touch it before she like left the stairwell and going into her bedroom. And I'm like, this is what finally validated those lost years of her life. So anyway, so the government apology was super important for the community to have. But ultimately, there was a lot of aspects of failure of leadership on all three branches, where you had the executive branch, issuing executive order, but then also, ignoring and suppressing intelligence for some of these reports. So Hawaii, sorry, let me back up. The Ringo report is very important because Hawaii didn't do a mass incarceration of Japanese Americans in Hawaii. And it's because there was all this reporting that's like, it's going to be economically devastating to that area. But this Ringo report was like, hey, there's really no need to do a mass incarceration because the government was monitoring the Japanese American community since the 30s, and they had these lists ready to go to pick people up. So that's why immediately after the attack on Pearl Harbor, they say, within hours, people are taken away. It's because they already had names. But I do want to just say no Japanese Americans were actually ever convicted of espionage or sabotage. So that is something that the government does acknowledge. But I do know I have to kind of wrap everything up. But, here's aspects of the failure of the leadership on the legislative branch where, this public law helped enforce EO 9066. And then we had the failures on the judicial branch where you had Korematsu, Hirabashi, and Yasui cases that was challenging different aspects of either the incarceration or curfew. And they actually suppressed evidence and then ruled in favor of U.S. policy, of the U.S. policies to still enact them. But it's really interesting to look at some of the dissent comments written by judges where some, like especially in the Korematsu case, it's like, hey, we are going into the dark abyss of racism was kind of the quote. I don't think I got it correctly, but anyways, but then you have constitutional rights violation of First Amendment right issues where there was restriction on freedom of religion and speech, whatnot. You had issues at the Fourth Amendment right with freedom from unreasonable searches and seizures. And then we have Fifth Amendment right issues with the right to due process, Sixth Amendment right issues where they never got a trial, and then Eighth Amendment issues right there from cruel and unusual punishment. But the biggest thing was the right to habeas corpus, where, hey, if you are under arrest, you should essentially be able to be brought before a judge or court to challenge it. And so Mitsuya Endo ended up filing a lawsuit and helped end the incarceration. And so she finally got recognized for her role during World War II earlier this year on January 2nd, where she was awarded the Presidential Citizens Medal and her work to help support the Japanese American community and get out of the camps. So it was her case that led to the closure of the camps. So anyway, so that's kind of everything in a quick nutshell. If you want to learn more, there's a great program that the Japanese American Memorial Pilgrimages does called Tadaima, and they have a great YouTube page that talks about different aspects of all the things I talked about that dives a lot deeper. So if you're interested, check them out. And thank you. This is my contact information. So if you ever need if you have any questions or anything, feel free to reach out. So I think that's the end of my presentation, so I'll send it back to Lauren.
Thank you, Hanako, for that really insightful and in-depth presentation. I know I learned a whole lot, and I am just guessing our audience at home also learned a lot as well. We have a couple of questions that have come in, so I'm going to go ahead and read those out for you. I think you mentioned this, but can you tell us how many incarceration camps were built?
So of the main sites, which we call the War Relocation Authority camps, there were 10 that people know about. So that's Minidoka, Manzanar, Tule Lake, Topaz. Oh, here, let me actually tell you the states. So Minidoka is in Idaho, Tule Lake and Manzanar are in California, Topaz is in Utah, Heart Mountain is in Wyoming, and then you had Poston and Gila River in Arizona. And then we have Rower and Jerome in Arkansas. Wait, okay, I'm at 9. What am I missing? But anyways, there's 10 of them out there.
Okay, excellent. And then our next question is Is there an estimate of how many Japanese people were sent to the centers/camps and how many survived?
Yeah, so the numbers that you normally will hear is like 110,000 people were forcibly removed and about 120,000 people were incarcerated. But that number has gone up to 125,284 as of right now, because there's a large research project that's being done by Duncan Williams out of USC that's actually trying to go through all the paperwork. But for the large, like I would say, the War Relocation Authority sites, about 110,000 were forcibly removed. There were about 8,000 live births in camp because life goes on. So that's why you have kind of the changes in the numbers there. But then you also have the folks, those Issei first generation men who were taken immediately after the attack on Pearl Harbor, that made up several thousand more. So that's why the total number that we have so far is 125,284. There were quite a few deaths in camp. A lot of it's due to like health issues because there were not the best medically equipped places. And then, due to old age and other factors. But I'm not sure the exact number of deaths were, but yeah, I think it's equitable to like a normal amount of people passing away. But yeah, so sorry, I can't give you a number.
Okay, understood. I have a question.
Mhm.
Do you know which camp was the largest?
The largest as in, okay, so I'm going to give you a couple answers. So largest land wise, I believe it was Heart Mountain because it was part of Bureau of Reclamation land. And I want to say it was like 50,000 acres or something. But largest population wise is actually Tule Lake because Tule Lake ended up becoming a segregation center where if the government determined that you were kind of like a rabble rouser, or if you answered this loyalty questionnaire incorrectly, and I'm using air quotes because it's all arbitrary, then they were sent to Tule Lake. So Tule Lake, I think about 26,000 people went through that facility. Peak population, I think, was like 18,000, like close to 19,000 people, which at the other camps, like peak population was usually around like 10 to maybe 13,000 people. But yeah, so that's kind of the multi-layered answer to that.
Okay, we have one more question that has come in, and I know we've gone a little long today, but thank you everybody for staying with us. Like I said, this has been a very engaging and insightful presentation. So we have a question. Do most of the locations have museums or some type of information presented on site about what took place at the location for people that might visit?
I would say many of them do, but they might not be actually on site. So, like Rower and Jerome in Arkansas, there's a museum in McGee, Arkansas, that kind of tells a story of both of them. Topaz, they have a museum there, but then you got some other nonprofits like Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation. They manage the history on sites in Wyoming, but then the National Park Service also manages other sites. So they manage Minidoka, Tule Lake, Manzanar, and now Amachi in Colorado. So they have different presence there and different types of facilities or visitor centers that you could go visit. But there's a lot of content online that's available. And a really good resource is called densho.org. So DENSHO.org, where they have like this online Wikipedia, online encyclopedia that kind of it's been vetted by academics, where you could kind of go and read up on different aspects on the individual sites, individual camps, and there's also images. It's a large online repository for digital images, oral histories, and it's a great resource.
Okay, so I lied. We had one more question come in while you were talking. So last question, actually, last question. Did the internees have to, or incarcerees have to work to earn money to buy food? How did that play out?
Yeah, so there was jobs in camp. So but they were capped at making $19 a month because the government didn't want to pay Japanese American incarcerees more than what a private first class in the military would get paid. So prior to war, most families brought in an income about like $150 a month to like $200 or $300 a month. So you can see that's a significant decrease. They were provided food in the mess halls, but the quality of food was not great. The government really wanted to spend, I think it was like less than like 40 cents a person on it. So, that's why some of the other sites, like I showed you the image of Minidoka, there was some agricultural areas was for folks to then cultivate resources to help supplement some of the food that was coming in. But if people were able to work and get money, they were able to then go to a co-op and maybe get some like treats or things as well to supplement their diet.
Okay. All right. So I want to say thank you again to everybody who joined us from home for today's webinar and for all the wonderful questions you sent in. And thank you again to our lovely presenter, Hanako. We appreciate your time and expertise in this matter. Before I let you go, I do want to remind everybody that we do have another webinar coming up next month. Our guest speaker will be Cecilia Gerlin, and she'll be talking about the Battle of Bataan and its significance during World War II and today. So don't forget to register for that. That's on March 19th. One last time, I want to say thank you to everybody for joining us today, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.